so then that one really landed, and I was like, oh, that was funny. I was funny, yay. And then 30 seconds later, I'm like, and so God, I'm like relating this to what God did. I was like, and so God decides to take like all humanity, which is mostly sinful, except for kind of Noah, and he puts all of them down under, but not in Australia, under a flood. And no one laughed.
I was saying, it's like, oh.
No one laughed. No one laughed. So it's like I was funny for a second, and then God was like, no. All right, welcome back to the follow-up. So I'm super excited because it was me and Jeff this last week that we got to do the sermons together, and we were like talking about Noah for weeks ahead of time. I felt like it was like every time I saw you, it's like, hey, how's the Noah thing coming?
Yeah, it was kind of a little bit of a trudging through, not suffering, but it was just like how do I even begin? How do I even begin to tackle this topic? So,
yeah. So, Jeff, can you just like start us out? We shared the same outline. You preached at Bellevue. I preached downtown. Can you do this in like 1 minute? Tell people what our sermon was about.
Okay, yeah, I think I can do it. So we walked in, we pretty much picked up right where we left off with the Adam, the covenant of creation, kind of summed up the curse of sin and death that went through chapters 4 through 6, and then the flood itself, and a little bit of why that happened. But then we doubled down on really the covenant, which was what we argued was that the covenant magnifies God's mercy and faithfulness, really tying it back to the covenant in the garden. Mm-hmm. And so it's faithfulness to those promises, mercy towards Noah and creation. And so the points we argued was that it extends to all of creation, not just humanity. It restored, kind of a recreation, humanity's purpose and worth. And then with the rainbow, it's evident, like you can see the covenants to all of creation.
Yeah.
And so just being able to see like God preserved and restrained his wrath so that there would be a people to like redeem and that Christ may enter into and the other covenants relate to. And so, So
that's awesome. Wow. That was less than a minute.
I did it. Okay.
Good job.
Sweet.
Awesome.
I'm always a little bit nervous about that.
No, you did a great job. Yeah. I mean, it was such an interesting week for me to dive that deep because it's like, I think we all have this kind of idea about Noah in our head from like our childhood, like VeggieTales or whatever it is about like who Noah was and what like that was all about, but to like actually dive into the covenant side was super interesting.
Right.
Were there things that you wanted to put in this week? I know there were, but like what is something that you wanted to put in the sermon, but you just didn't have time for?
Oh gosh, there were so many like on the front end. I don't know if it would have affected the covenant side of things, but we talked a little bit about just chapter 6, like where the sons of God and the daughters of men.
Oh,
like,
right.
And that whole thing where it's like there's some people who see that as like angelic beings mating with females and creating this race of giants.
Right.
And just some spiritual warfare things going on there.
Yep.
Local flood, global flood, like participating in that debate. But then there was one part in the text, and I alluded to it a little bit in my sermon, but this part where it says, like, I'll never again curse the ground because of man. Like that, there was a part of me that was like, what's going on in this? Like, I kind of stumbled because I'm like, is that an undoing or a little bit of an undoing of what happened with Adam's curse? And so that was those were some of the big ones where I was like, I can't go there. I want to so bad, but
right. And well, you kind of mentioned that I think a little bit in your sermon, but then we concluded that like no, scholars don't really think it's even it's not even using the same words on the curse to ground thing. So that's interesting. For me on my side, you talked a little bit more about this than I did, but I wish I could have talked more about this idea that like our points were all about God's mercy and faithfulness. And yet the context of all of this is that God has just destroyed everything. And there was a piece in there that actually we had a family discussion about, which was like God basically says in the covenant that he values human life because humans are created in the image of God. And yet he takes so much human life in the flood and like the tension between those two things and like to like focus in on his mercy versus his justice and like the tension of all that. And it's like, so you're going to hold people to account for taking other human life, but you destroyed all these people in a flood. And I think people who are skeptics just naturally have that question when they hear about Noah and the flood, like, oh wow, God was like really harsh here, and like,
is God playing by his own rules?
Right,
like
exactly.
Like,
and I, and it's like, I don't know if the answer to that is always satisfactory, but like, I was thinking like, if you step back for a second, you realize like, actually God is the only one who has a right to make that judgment to take human life, because he's delivering true justice, right? Like he's the only one who's able to distinctively step back and say, every inclination of the human heart is wicked all of the time. And so like my judgment requires that I do something about it, right? And so like God's the only one who can make that decision. And so when he tells humans to respect human life, it's not that human life isn't inherently valuable. It is. It's that they can't make that judgment. In other words, if you look over your neighbor and your neighbor has a new Ferrari and you're jealous and you kill him to get his Ferrari, like that's a bad judgment, right? And so that's kind of what's being pointed out there is like God's saying like, don't make the judgment to kill somebody else. And it seems that like pre-flood, maybe there was a lot more violence and there wasn't repercussions there like there should have been for people that God was making after the flood, which is like, if you kill somebody, then we have a right to punish you for that taking of a human life, Yeah. So,
well, and even when you're talking right there, I'm just thinking about the lifeblood aspect. Like we didn't really get into that at all.
Right.
It relates a little bit to the Mosaic law, and like God even in the Mosaic law holds animals accountable for when they kill people. And so like there's that aspect too, where it's like all of creation is kind of playing by these rules, and God is in a category in and of itself, and so we've talked about, just the dangerousness of like putting ourselves in the place of God to say like, this is right, this is wrong, where it's like,
we don't have all the variables. Right. And so it's like, we can't play that game where we're like, if I were God, because we're not, we don't have any idea what that means. And so it really comes down to just like trusting him, like trusting that God is just, that he's also merciful, that he shows us his grace in Jesus, like all of those things. So I'm curious, you had some takeaways and I had some takeaways. I think my takeaways were different than yours, but what was like one thing that you wanted people coming off of the covenant with Noah to kind of implement in their lives?
Yeah. So, I mean, like, I think one of the big things was just I think sometimes the struggle with a covenant series like we're doing is not seeing the interrelatedness. And so both seeing like the tie to the Adamic or the covenant of creation, but then also how this covenant in particular that feels very different than a lot of the others we're going to get into, how that ties into, the later covenants. I think the nesting dolls analogy was kind of used. And so being able to see and people to marvel in a way that's not just, oh, that's a neat story and I got a good history lesson and I guess that's cool that I know that, but like, can this actually fuel my worship? Like, does this actually impact me? And so that was one of the things of like, let's create in this series, like an interconnectedness and not like God's reacting and here's plan A, B, C, D.
Right.
Like,
Yes, that's so important. Yeah. No, this is his plan of redemption unfolding, and you can kind of see them throughout the covenants. And I think, that's really incumbent on us as pastors to really make sure we're like tying those loose ends together and like showing people, here's the thread that goes all the way through. Yeah, absolutely. I think one of my takeaways that I talked about was the first thing Noah does when he is saved and gets off the ark is he like sacrifices these animals. And sometimes we see that as like, oh, he does like this religious practice because he had to. And it's like, no, what he's doing there is he's being thankful towards God because God saved him. Right. And saved humanity through him, really. And like, he's saying to God, like, thank you for sparing my family. And he's showing gratitude. He's showing worship. And so like, my takeaway is that like, hey, that should be us, right? Like Jesus, like the ark is a foreshadowing of Jesus, right? And it's Jesus who now saves. And if we know that as followers of Jesus, like the response of God's mercy in our lives should be gratitude. It should be worship of our lives, right? And so like just how important that is like to live our lives as lives of worship, as acts of worship towards God.
That's good. So. And especially, I think that ties well to just Noah, like having grace, like being given grace by the Lord. So it's not like he's awarded because he's awesome. Like God gave him grace and choosing him. And so, so his response being one of worship is, So
in the sermon, I said, what is the first thing Noah did when he got off the ark? Do you remember? And someone came up to me afterwards and said, like, they're like, I thought you were going to say he got naked.
Nice.
I was like, oh, yeah, that's a little bit later on in the story. But the first thing he does.
He got drunk and fell asleep in his tent.
Yes. Yes. I was like, what? Weird. Okay. Yeah. But the first thing he does is actually worship God, right?
That's true. So we can't miss that.
Yes, we can miss that. So, but anyways. Yeah, so on that note, thanks so much for tuning in to the follow-up this week, and we'll catch you next time.
If you liked the follow-up and this content, we would just encourage you to like our video.
Yeah, and also we would love for you to subscribe to our channel. You can do that by hitting the bell icon. And as always, we love to get comments from people. And so if you have a comment, maybe it's something you're wrestling with from the sermon or something you've been thinking about, throw it underneath, and we'd love to get a conversation going about some of these covenants that we're covering in the follow-up. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll catch you next week.